conversation around the pilgrimage route. Glad that a few of our youth are here because we've got some relevant questions today that you're better situated to answer than some of the others of us. There's a little different theme each week, but in general, this is along my pilgrimage route of El Camino de Santiago through Spain, the north part of Spain, and some themes that I picked up along the way, and some stories, and invite you also to share from your stories, from your experience. And so the past themes have been things like gratitude, pilgrimage itself, hospitality, forgiveness, and today, saints and angels and public witness, part one. There's more to say than what we'll talk about today, but this is a statue along this part of the route that I came along inside a church, and that statue is, does anyone know? Can you guess? Which saint that might be? James. It's not. There are lots of statues of St. James because it's called the Way of St. James. This is St. Ignatius, who is a very important saint person, religious leader in Spain, who was later called a saint by the church. And so we'll talk about him a little bit along the way. But this is walking along the way to a place called Navarrete, a little village, and you see it's just kind of a very varied weather, varied landscape, a lot of country walking. This is the end of the territory called La Rioja. You can see the vineyards in the background. And maybe you've had Rioja wine, anyone? It's a red wine that comes from this region of Spain. And so it's not dissimilar to this part of the Santa Clara Valley, where there are hills around and vineyards and particular varietals that grow well. And also there are huge tanks, and you can smell the wine because it's in these just much bigger than silos in the Midwest, just huge tanks of the wine that's produced. And it's drunk locally. It's not expensive because it's a wine-producing region. There's a little different sense of that than maybe here, where you'll pay a certain amount for our local wines when you go to the grocery store. A few of the wineries let you bottle your own and you can do it for cheaper, but in this part of Spain, the bars and restaurants will just pour local for very inexpensive costs. So as I'm approaching the town of Navarrete, like many places, but even more so there, what stands out to you in that town? It's really obvious, this church in a town that's not that big a town, but people decided to build really take the best real estate to create a building for the public as a house of worship. And this is an example of that.
Were the churches bigger than, could hold the congregation larger than the community?
Yeah. And the question is, were the churches built so that they could hold a congregation larger than the community? And that might take me a little more research to actually answer, because just like here, the populations of the towns and villages varies over the centuries, right? And so some towns that are now small were once bigger, and others have grown a lot from smaller towns. So in each case, I think you'd have to look at what was the population at the time that that was built. But I'll address it a little more when I get to Leon, because that is a big example of a community that built a church for their size. They were 5,000 when
We
built
were
the
not in Spain, but elsewhere, where each community wanted to build a church that was bigger than the neighboring community.
Oh, it was like competition, yeah.
Competition in church size.
There's definitely a feeling around that, yeah.
Does it depend upon who built the church, whether it's Jesuit church or Franciscan?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that depended on the era too, and who was prominent locally, what sort of folks built it. But anyway, so I went. I was traveling from one town, and Navarrete was the halfway point, and it was on a Sunday. So most places have a noon mass on Sunday. So I was very happy to be able to, set the goal of I want to get to Navarrete before noon, then I could go to Sunday Mass, which is a little fuller celebration than the weekday Mass or the evening pilgrim masses. And, got there to the town square. And you hear the bells, maybe faintly, but the bells are clanging, the square, it's a whole different sense of calling the community to worship a few minutes before worship starts. And there it is on the big town square. Were they well attended? It depended on the place, but Sunday masses tended to be well attended. The evening masses, there would be usually anywhere from 6 to 25 locals in a small church, and then however many pilgrims were there on the weeknight masses. So the local folks were providing that worship hospitality and community for the pilgrims who came through on the weekdays. But Sundays were mostly for the local communities, and then the pilgrims were just guests along the way. And that was my experience there in Navarrete. And so I invite you to have a little bit of conversation about how does the outside presentation of the church building give testimony to a life of worship? And does that still communicate for secular people who have had no experience of church worship? Like if someone, I met my first, close friend who was totally secular in college, who, had like very basic questions because she had never been to a church service, never participated in any religious life of any kind. And so I'm curious and would invite you to have a little conversation at your table about, what does the outside of the building communicate, if anything? And how do you think that communicates with people who don't have experience? Or maybe you've heard from your friends or neighbors. So spend just a few minutes talking with each other. Then on this one, I'll invite your tables to share a little more widely what you come up with if you think there's something that comes up that's important from your own table. So what do you think? What are some things that arose in your conversations around these questions?
Our conversation was not about building, but people.
Okay, you went into people.
We wound up talking more about that.
Okay.
And And ritual, like going into a church and you have to put your hand in the water and.
What's the experience of the ritual like?
Feeling uncomfortable about not knowing what you're supposed to do.
Okay, okay. Well, let's hear more about this one too. What came up at other tables?
How formal the church is. And out, or is it definitely Catholic? When you see all the churches with the elaborate things, where they all mention the Catholic.
Okay.
I didn't get that, but did you?
Well, then, you knew that there were Catholic churches, because they're all, you know, if you've been to Europe, all the churches were, and they're very elaborate. And that, you know, you saw the carvings and the relief that they have. They're always very sort of formal type, almost, and elaborate. They're not simple like our ones or anything, right? At least.
What about that? What about the outside of church buildings? Just when you're driving by or approaching a town?
Well, one of the observations we made was over time, old Europe, right, churches really stuck out.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about small towns in the Midwest and the East, where the church sticks out. I mean, the spires are high. We're talking about Decorah, Iowa, it has 4 or 5 churches. And if you stand a little bit on a high spot, those churches stick out. Lutheran, Catholic.
The prominence of church buildings in older European cities and also in some of the towns and cities of the U.S. and the whole Western Hemisphere, really.
Now, churches
South
are prominent like that. They don't stick out. The average person might not even see them.
Today, they're not so prominent. Okay. What else?
It was very clean and plain on the outside, which you noticed because it was so beautiful, but very plain.
The beautiful, clean, plain.
Right.
Okay. Yes.
Well, we did talk about the fact that the outside appearance of the church, the presence, can make a difference in terms of its attraction to people. Some people see more holiness maybe or more presence when they see a big church. On the other hand, in some parts of the country, it's kind of interesting where you'll see one church and then, then it's pretty substantive. In the next block, the next one will be bigger and higher spires, and the next one, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're full of people, especially in this time, how post-COVID especially, those assumptions about churches in those parts of the country that you would normally might have thought, well, they're well attended. It's not necessarily true.
That's right. A church, the size of a building doesn't anymore tell the story about the attendance and worship.
I will say in 1977, when we were moving from Southern California to Morgan Hill, because, looking for a house, when we came across 101 up here, because someone told us to go up, Dunn Avenue, and I saw that cross out there, I knew my prayers were answered for finding the next Lutheran church that I would belong to.
The cross drew your eye to the property. Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And the first Sunday that we lived in Morgan Hill, before I had boxes unpacked and everything, I came to church, and I'm still here.
Yes.
What was your observation when you would attend Sunday Mass? Was it a handful of people with a few tourists or pilgrims? How did communities really come out for worship?
Yeah. It varied depending on the town or village. But there was decent attendance, including at some of the smaller churches. I'll get to some of those stories, in future times too, but also in, big city of Burgos, which was the next big city along this way. Went to I can't remember if it was a Saturday afternoon or Sunday morning mass, that it was packed. There were nuns in full habits who were putting folding chairs at the end of the rows. And all generations were there, you know, whole families with extended families, babies, teenagers, kids, behaving pretty much like they would anywhere in the world, right? I mean, you know, it's a formal liturgy, but people are people, and people were just kind of joyfully happy to be there the way they were. So it was interesting. I expected to find more empty churches than I did at masses, but at Sunday Mass, there was a pretty good representation. Now, in some of the towns and villages, there weren't as many young people in worship, but in others there were lots. And I showed a slide last time of, you know, during the Pilgrim's Mass, we were put over in the side chapel, and the children's class was happening in the main sanctuary. And there were lots of, you know, kids there with a handful of people who were teaching them something. I didn't get close enough to hear what they were covering that day. Yes?
I was just in Nebraska with my daughter, little town, 1,200 people. The Lutheran church the Catholic church is on the way in and kind of, as you might expect, Grant. The Lutheran church is a little higher up with a big white steeple, brick, very formal looking. When I checked it online, I thought, oh, this looks kind of old fashioned and stuffy. Maybe they're Missouri Synod. Well, I'd be welcome. And so I did go, and it was a small congregation with a brand new pastor and his pastor wife. They were doing a shared ministry.
A clergy couple.
Yeah, who hadn't been ordained yet. That was to happen that Friday.
Okay.
But a lot of young people, they had new members coming in the next week, and more casual. They did have a screen with things on it, and and friendly.
So you as an active church person made some assumptions about how the church might be based on the look of the building.
Oh, yeah.
That's what you're telling me. And you as someone who's in church leadership and is sort of, but we still judge books by the cover sometimes.
We do.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
told my table when we moved here, we drove past, missed the cross, and thought this was a Mexican restaurant. Mexican restaurant? Oh, yeah. No tile roof.
You thought this was a Mexican restaurant.
Yeah,
All right. Great. Good conversations. Good for us to, I think, stay in touch with these questions. So here's a church. I mentioned last time that my experience of the churches that were built in pre-Columbian times versus post-Columbian times. You see, the gold that came from the New World went into the churches, as you can see.
It isn't only built, they can be built earlier and still collect the gold and do this.
That's true. They could add to some of the older ones, but many of the older ones were kept more simple.
Not the ones that we saw.
Okay. But especially in the front, you see something like this, and what do you notice when you look at?
Yeah.
What do you?
Opulence.
Opulence, right? What do you notice in terms of the figures?
The statues?
What's being portrayed, proclaimed by that?
Well, it looks like Mary takes center stage.
It does, doesn't it? So it looks like Mary takes center stage. And this is not unusual in Spain, but this was called, the church in Navarrete was called the Church of the Assumption. Who's a Catholic person here who can tell us about the Assumption?
Oh, geez,
So the Assumption is a Catholic teaching that doesn't come from the Bible but comes from tradition. that
It's
Mary,
August 15th, I think.
okay, there's a feast day of Mary, when Mary was assumed into heaven. She didn't, die buried, but that she was brought to heaven as she was, Mary, the mother of God, Mary, Jesus' mom. So it's kind of true that she takes center stage, but let your eye go up, and then you see in the actual center is Christ on the cross, Jesus on the cross. And so there's both, and then, further up, Queen of Heaven, and, so there's,
Is that Mary right above the altar there?
yeah.
Is
Yeah,
it?
that's Mary with a crown and a
Okay.
veil. It's the Church of the Assumption, so it's Mary, Queen of Heaven. It's the celebrating that, and that imagery does come from the Book of Revelation too, where there's a sort of a Queen of Heaven in John the Divine's vision, and so let's talk about this. Mary and the saints are more prominent visually and also in the worship life of the Christians in Spain. There you see a little more closely, but she might be center, but you see all of these, of course, when people weren't literate, and even when they are, for visual thinkers, the depictions of the saints give opportunities to tell stories, like, Mama, who's that guy? Why is he carrying a sword? Well, let me tell you, then the story follows.